Hi, this is Samir.
This is Bomani.
This is our Sprint 1 video for the ARS SIG. So for this part of the sprint, we started out really scraping the data that we started from last time, which is high-level questions as well as expected roadblocks that we added to this sheet. So really we just added a little bit of data on getting these high-level questions, so the purpose and deliverable and then a roadblock. And then we put it in a new Mongo Lab collection. So as you can see here that we have deliverables and the purpose for many of our tasks. So it's actually really good results for this. We've had practically 100% adherence for high-level questions for the purpose and deliverable, and about 13% of the tasks now have roadblocks, which is actually quite high because we didn't expect people. It's an optional column for them to use.
So the next thing that we focused on during the sprint are trying to generate some mock-ups that we wanted to get out and test as far as learning more about the space of high-level planning. So specifically, we started focused on learning more about the generation and evaluation of alternatives that students can take to completing a story in their sprint and looking at how we might be able to make those decisions more powerful for the research that students are working on. So we started by brainstorming 15 different ideas about interfaces that we could use to help students do high-level planning, and we settled on a diagram that you can see in the picture here, and it begins with a sort of overall objective for the sprint. It breaks out into stories, which are the edges in between the branching point, and the branching points there go to a couple of different deliverables, which are marked by those squares. And those are basically alternative pathways that students could use to complete the story. Um,
So these are just some examples of our diagramming that we did some testing in house for these.
so the next thing that we did after that was talk to Matt Easterday about the research roadmap him and a few other people are working on. We read through that just to learn more about the sort of hypothesized process that they're talking about in the document here about going through the entire research process. And we felt that just the discussion there might have some interesting pointers for us as far as thinking about the space of high-level research planning. Another thing that we were pointed on to by Matt Easterday and Hao Chi Zhang was the, towards the theory of impasse-driven learning paper. And we read through this just to learn more about the space of impasse-driven learning and understanding how students can effectively learn good practices for approaching issues that they face, as well as developing like motivation to tackle those issues during the planning process.
The final paper we kind of read is opportunistic planning. So the idea of that people plan opportunistically in many different planes of planning, that they don't just do top down or bottom up, but many planners do plan where it's more opportunistic. So there are lots of different planning planes just to think about and really what DTR students need help with. And section 5 of this paper by Hayes Roth was really interesting because it talked about how to improve planners.
The next thing we did to learn more about the space of high level planning was talk to a couple folks who have had to work in agile settings in the industry, and specifically we wanted to know about how high level objectives for a company or an organization gets carried down to sprint level objectives, especially in a sort of larger company setting. And so we talked to Eureka Fung and Josh from the lab here about their experiences in the industry, and we had some really interesting findings for them from both of them. And we also talked to Josh a little bit more about student regulation and his thoughts on just some of the issues that he's found that students have faced, where they need help, skills where they excel, and we learned a lot of great stuff about student regulation from him from that discussion as well.
One of the kind of big conversations we had was getting students to reach impasses. We had a really good example of Ryan, a student in the lab who realized his team was lacking communication, so they made like a reminder system for them to communicate. So we're planning on interviewing him right after the SIG meeting.
So after doing the testing sessions and reading through these papers, we had a couple of sort of major insights that came to us throughout the course of the sprint. The first that we found from our testing specifically is that many students lack regulation skills. Specifically, they don't necessarily have the skills or motivation at this point in their research development process to seek out best strategies and best routes for reaching their overall goals for their work. And we also found that students tend to have somewhat of a solution focused or mechanical approach to work. We hypothesized this might be coming from just the standard educational process where you're given an assignment and you complete it. And so we think this kind of lends itself to maybe like a very features driven mindset where you list out a couple features and you say, okay, we need to do this now versus thinking about the learning value and the additional value that studying something or doing something at a mock-up level can add to your overall research space and your claims. And we also find that just generally students lack sort of unstructured project and research process skills as well as like the tools to evaluate their process.
Yeah, so going back to like the impasses we found really interesting was that we really want students to have self-generated awareness of impasse. Right now, we hypothesize that the mentor generates awareness of impasses for them, and it's not really they see it as a problem. The impasse is at the project level, and there's a project problem, but rather the impasse is my mentor is asking me a question. I need to answer it. So we want to change that to really have the student take ownership of that impasse and really understand it rather than the mentor generating it for them. For our next steps, we really want to focus on building regulation abilities of students. We've come with some really good insights so far, and we want to build or implement a system to really test because we've done a lot of understanding of our user group.